Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, back with another article review. In this episode, I want to talk about this really interesting new systematic review paper by, let me get here, Jake Cowan and colleagues, looking at one of my favorite topics, movement variability. So, this is a systematic review. It's fully open access. You can find the link in the notes for the podcast or the video. I very much encourage you to go read this. It's got a lot of great review and highlight some specific studies, but I want to go through kind of a basic look at this paper and talk about some of its implications. So the authors start with a, kind of a background, right? Right. I think hopefully everyone's pretty much convinced now that we've accepted that movement variability is good. Okay. So if we're gonna obviously try to define movement variability a bit better in this paper, and I'm going to talk about that. But if we just start with a very broad definition that movement variability are normal variations that occur in motor performance across multiple repetitions of a task, right? So what we're talking about is within subject variability. You your golf swing being slightly different every time you stand up the tee. We're not talking about across subject or between subject variability, where we're looking at how elite performers differ in their movements, right? We've obviously, hopefully, there's a large amount of research. One of the main things I tried to put forth in my book about the revolution, one of the revolutionary ideas that has happened is we've moved away from the idea that this variability in execution, this failure to repeat the movement over and over, is actually a good thing. It's not noise, it's advantageous because it allows us to adapt to constraints. And there's lots of research, you can find it on my website, I've highlighted, showing that elite performers are better able to adapt to constraints, right? They don't achieve the same their goal by moving in the same way every time, right? The classic repetition without repetition, right? So the authors do a good job of saying that, So movement variability is good, but what exactly is it? What the heck is it, right? And that's a question I get from a lot of people. Like, okay, so not swinging the same way every time is good in baseball, but does that mean I can just vary anything, right? There must be something good in there. And along with this, idea that variability is good and showing repetition without repetition is good, there's also a growing body of research showing that, well, okay, not all of it is good, right? And it's not the simple story that you just can vary anything. There seems to be, both in terms of performance and injury reduction, there's kind of, the authors call it a Goldilocks zone, an optimal zone of kind of some variability, but not crazy amount of variability, right? And I talk about this a lot. We talked about this in the last episode, the idea of variance and invariance, right? There's some things about movement you don't want to vary from execution to execution. They want them to be invariant, right? And Carl Newell and their colleagues have done a great amount of work on this recently, showing that this is not a simple. We're moving beyond. Okay, everyone accepts the repetition without repetition story with a basic general idea. Let's dig down now, and when we dig down, we find it's not that simple, right? Not all. We didn't expect it to be in a complex system, right? So there's probably some optimal amount of variability going on, right? So if we kind of accept all this, then we kind of have to really get a little more subtle, a little more detailed, a little more specific when we talk about variability. If we want to understand what the good stuff is, how much is good, and what you see in the literature and the authors highlight really well in the review is there's people use the term movement variability in a lot of different ways, right? For example, if we're talking about basketball, you can have variability in the shot you're shooting, whether you do a layup, a dunk, or a jump shot. You can have a variability in how the release angle, for example, and then you can have a variability in the outcome, right? So those are just kind of three broad categories. And so the author's main point, and also, variability, one of the things we talk a lot about in ecological dynamics, ecological approach, is a lot of the variability that has been studied in research uses endpoint variability, right? So taking the standard deviation of your elbow angle across a bunch of trials. That's a valid measure and it's useful, but what you lose in there is the underlying structure of the variability, right? What's going on in the actual time series, the complexity, The coupling, the synergy, all that is lost when you just reduce it to one number, a standard deviation. So there's lots of different ways we can define variability, and the main conclusion they make, which I think we would all sympathize with, the often used term movement variability is a broad term that does not capture the specifics of what has been investigated. If we want to get deeper into this and understand better which types of variability are good, which types as a coach we should be encouraging, which types we should step in and say, nope, I don't, that's not good, and add a constraint to try to stop that. We need to understand, be more specific and more clear about what we're talking about when we talk about movement variability. So in their paper, they did a systematic review. They looked at sports-related studies that measured some aspect of movement variability. They had to have a quantified measure within it. And surprisingly, I thought, I always say when I talk about these kind of studies that, wow, if you've never done one of these systematic reviews, man, they're hard, right? Because go Google movement variability in sport, you'll get a million hits, right? And so they did a great job of filtering it down and a lot of work, and they described the process in the paper. But in the end, they found only 43 studies, which I found kind of surprising on one hand, but I guess not. On the one I thought there would be more. I think I talked about, maybe last year I talked about Bernstein's studies that have investigated freezing degrees of freedom, one of the fundamental ideas in motor control. And I think there were only 10 or something. So maybe it's not all that surprising. But their main conclusion, if they looked at, and they go in a lot of detail, I encourage you to look at this. There were 200 different 80 terms used. A lot of them, the majority of them were undefined, which is, that's not how we're supposed to do research, right? You're supposed to be more clear. Oftentimes, the same term was used in very, very different ways. For example, coordination variability is a term that sometimes you see in the literature. Sometimes that's used in terms of a cluster analysis. That's the tennis study I often talk about by Lee and colleagues, where they looked at the number of clusters for forehands before and after either a constraints-based approach or a prescriptive approach, and they found more clusters after using a constraint-based approach, suggesting greater coordination variability. It's also used as kind of looking at endpoints, and so it's used in very, very different ways. And so what the authors want to try to do after this analysis, they recognize, and they 100% agree with them, that we need some framework to talk how we're going to talk about movement variability, right? And they emphasize, right, a framework is supposed to be a simple overarching thing, right? It's not supposed to be super detailed and generate specific hypothesis. It's a way to categorize our thinking. And the one they reference that they want to kind of build on is Carl Newell's three-stage model of motor control, which I talked about back in 171. If you're interested, he talked about, basically, for example, it's very different between finding initial coordination pattern for swinging a tennis racket, right, versus parameterizing a pattern that you already have, right, from another sport, right? If I play squash and I go onto a tennis court, right, a large part of what I'm doing is just parameterizing. I'm in the control stage, right? I'm gonna maybe make some adjustment, but I'm not making vast adjustments in the overall topology of a stroke, right? That's a coordination stage. So Carl Newell recognized, we're often lumping these things together and confusing them. And, so he developed this three-stage model, and that's kind of what the authors wanted to do in their study, right? So they propose a simple theoretical framework where we divide movement variability into three different types. And this is based on the literature that they did, right? And so they talk about strategic variability, execution variability, and outcome variability. And there's a diagram there if you go to the paper, and you can see, these three types. So let's talk about these a little bit more. So strategic variability is when you use different approaches or movements to complete the same task, right? So in basketball, my task is getting the ball in the hoop. I could do this with a jump shot, a dunk, a layup, a floater, right? There's lots of different ways. So those the authors consider to be different strategies, right? And they do that, so we do that. The second type of variability is execution variability. The execution variability is within the same strategy, the intentional or unintentional adjustments of the body, right? So within the same strategy, making a jump shot, I can have variations in my release angle or variations in the force in my wrist at release. Okay. So those are execution, the same skill, very the differences in the actual movement itself, right? So of course, what we're talking about there is repetition without repetition. We're trying to repeat the same outcome but we're doing it with different forces, different body movements, different positions. And then the outcome, the differences in the result or the product of the movement, right? So what's the outcome? Okay. And the authors, to quote from the paper, to solve a movement problem, the athlete will select a strategy from a pool of appropriate strategies that suit the athlete's constraints, environment, and task. The strategy is then executed by moving the body in a certain manner to produce a resultant outcome. One of the things the authors do well in the paper, and I'm going to do a bit more of my own at the end, is connect these ideas with existing motor learning, motor control concepts, and they recognize that this can get a little muddy, right? One of the things, for example, if you look at the classic, one of the things I like to harp on about the blocked versus random, variability of practice research. You know, Technically, when we're talking about blocked practice, we're talking about blocked versus random. We're talking about variations in different skills, right? So that would fit with variations in different strategies, right? So in this model, right? So in golf, I want to get the ball to the hole, right? I could do it with a driver, a chip shot, a long iron, a fairway wood, a putter, right? Those are my goal is the same. I'm using different approaches or movements to get the ball there, right? Um, so in classic variable practice, right, a lot of times people confuse constant versus variable and blocked versus random. Block versus random is supposed to be varying the actual skill or the strategy, I think would fit with this ball. But then we get a bit blurry, right? So, is hitting a downhill lie versus an uphill lie a different skill? Or is it a different strategy? Or is it a variation in execution within the same strategy, right? And the authors recognize, yeah, this is a problem. It's a little muddy, right? So, but I think, we have to try to kind of lay some groundwork at least to think about it, right? And so I understand why they're doing this. Um, I think we're moving more towards, these categories of skill, starting to like one of the things I'm trying to do in baseball is move away a bit from distinct categories to thinking of it all as an adaptation of movement, right? But I understand what the authors are trying to achieve here. Okay. Some points they kind of make about this. The first point they make: clear statements or definitions by the researcher or practitioner of how the strategies are categorized can reduce gray areas between strategies, particularly when there may not be distinctive. So this was the kind of the first point I'm talking about. I think it's probably worthwhile to still try to think of things as, they as different skills or different strategies. With execution variability should be quantified across repetitions within the same strategies, as comparisons across multiple strategies can provide inflated measures that are difficult to interpret. I agree with this to a certain extent, right? I agree with this. You know, I think, I agree in a research sense, you don't want to combine measures, the variability in movement from a jump shot and a layup, right? There's just going to be a lot of noise, right? So I agree with that to a certain extent. But, I think there's a lot of information of it there in understanding what needs to be similar between a layup and a jump shot, right? So even though I have different strategies, like go back to my golf example, fairway wood, long iron, chip shot, there are things that need to be there in each of those, whether we want to call those invariants, attractors, whatever. So I think in some sense, comparing across multiple strategies is useful in some sense. But the point the author is trying to make, just lumping it together in a number is not. Okay. They also emphasize that when we're talking about outcome variability, and again, we can connect this to feedback research in motor learning, knowledge of results, knowledge of feedback, knowledge of performance, right? So we can talk both about the results, right? Did the ball go in the hoop? Okay. And the performance. What was the spin on the ball? What was the trajectory, right? So we can talk both about both of these things in outcome variability, right? So I think this is really interesting, and as I said, the authors do a good job of connecting it with a lot of different things in motor learning. Here's a couple few things I would add, right? Oh, a couple more of their discussions first. The authors, they point out, one of the things that people have talked a lot about. Rajiv talked about this in some of his work. Is often you can lump things into strategies versus synergies, right? Strategies deciding what movement you're going to perform. Are you going to do a layup or a jump, do a pull up jumper? And then synergy, which is the execution. Like, so the authors draw a nice connection between those. They also, I'll encourage you to read the paper for this. They show how they talk about how this can be used in practice design, right? So if you have an individual with low strategic or execution variability, right? So they always shoot with the right hand in basketball, and they always use the exact same release point or release arc, right? This is we consider this a lack of adaptability that your opponent can exploit. Okay. So this is something we work on in practice, right? And if we're sticking with basketball, right? Stephen Curry is the king of high strategic and high execution variability, right? He does not shoot a jump shot the same way every time, even close, right? He has 42 different jump shots, right? He can do depending on the position of defender, where he is on the court, etc. That with variations, he adapts to the variations and constraints. Okay, so I think those are good points as well. A few of my thoughts, right? Trying to further connect it, right? I think in a lot of ways this aligns nicely with the idea of education of intention, right? So when we're talking about your strategy, right, we're talking about what you intend to do, right? What you intend. Do you intend to do a layup? Do you tend to do a jump shot, right? For me, I think this is where I think about education of intention, right? And skilled intentionality is keeping multiple of those open, right? Is dribbling the ball so I could, when going down a court, dribbling a ball so I could do a floater or a jump shot or a dunk or a layup. Like, I'm keeping those open, right? So strategic variability is, you need to have those obviously in your toolbox, being able to do those things, and overlying that is picking up. So strategic variability is being able to do those different skillful movements. Education of intention is being able to pick up the information from the environment, which about which one is best, which one is afforded, right? And then, it's the skilled intentionality is the ability to keep them open a lot. So I think it fits in nicely. When we vary our strategy, we set up information movement control law, right? So I like to think of education of attention as more than just saying I'm going to do a layup and having that very general. I like to think that also intention is at the level of, I'm going to control this part of my movement using this information, right? Um, One of the things I've been really thinking about a lot and talking with coaches and practice designers, we don't vary this nearly enough in practice. Strategic variability, intentions, whatever you want to call it, right? In particular, in an information-driven, purposeful way. Most of the time in practice, we give the athlete a very general, vague intention: hit the ball on the feet, hit the ball in baseball. Or we hand them a specific one: hit the ball to the opposite field. We very rarely give them, and give them a choice to educate their attention, to know, and that's of course decision. A lot of what decision making is selecting the right intention, right, based on the information, having the right intention emerge. Okay, so I think we could do a lot better with designing practices where we vary intentions, right? I think we can get a lot of thing going there. The execution variability, I like that they're pulling that out. They talk a lot about good things. This is something I've been trying to do, and a lot of things I've been talking about lately. For me, there's a couple points I would add on top of theirs. One, I think we need to, and of course they recognize this is a high level framework. One of the things we need to do is dig down within the execution variability to start identifying what's the good and what's the bad. I talked about elemental variables versus essential, attract invariance versus variance, right? So I want to keep doing that within the execution variability. Okay. And I've talked about this in some of the baseball work I've done. For example, in a lot of the baseball work research, we find that when you're executing a pitch, right, you want your hand position at the release point to have low variability, whereas the joint configurations that produce that hand position have relatively higher variability, right? So we can start breaking apart this execution. It's also important to point out that execution variability is not only to with the purpose of achieving, same with strategic variability. Its purpose is not only to achieve your goal, right? That's perception to action. We also have the other half of the coupling, right? Action to perception. We gain information by varying these things as well. Okay. The last thing I will say, with in terms of outcome variability, also obviously outcome variability is one of them is a very important, valuable source of information about we use to calibrate our movements, right? So when we swing and we do foul off the ball, or we get a vibration, or the ball goes foul, or which are result both in performance and results variation, we use that to calibrate our information movement control law. Um, I've talked about this in the past. I think we can start, we can do this, manipulate this purposely in practice by using a lot of different equipment, right? For example, the great work by Tim Buzzard and colleagues in tennis, using plyo care balls for hitting, right? What we're really doing there is we could think about we're varying the task constraints, but what we're really varying is the outcome variability. We're varying the information you get from your swing, right? Based on the contact. We're adding more in there, right? Depending on your contact, because a plyo care ball is soft, right? So if you mishit it, you're going to get more variability in the results you get and the performance feedback you get, right? So overall, I think this is a nice kind of launching point to start thinking about in terms of the practical. In practice, we need to move. I think we've done a great job getting more variability into practice. I think everyone's starting to get on board. We need to vary the conditions. We don't want the same thing. We don't want strict repetition. We don't want the drills where everything's the same. But the the what we need to do, I think, is start to get a little more subtle and thoughtful and purposeful in how we vary variability, right? So we're not just, okay, let's throw a bunch of different bat weights. Let's throw this small sided game, that small sided game. I think we can start thinking about, okay, we're going to get this execution variability by throwing in different weights, different sizes of equipment. Now let's get some strategic variability, or variability in attention by the instructions we give, or the rules, right? Then let's get some outcome variability by changing the scoring system or changing the equipment, right? So I think there's a lot more we can do by understanding this. So I think this is a great paper, it gives me a lot to think about, and I would encourage everyone to read it. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.